In this video, we're going to refer to the fungus. So let's talk a little bit about the kingdom fungi or fungus. It's a great big diverse group. To date, they only have a little over 100,000 of the fungal species identified. And even notice, only a little bit over 100 of them are known to be disease causers. Okay, so there are only 100 or so that are known as human and animal pathogens. Now, within the kingdom fungus, you're going to find both macroscopic, those big, large mushrooms, and microscopic organisms. Now, most fungi are multicellular, but we do have a group known as the yeast, which are the unicellular fungi. Now, when you talk about fungus and you're talking about doing research or the studying of it, we call it mycology. So a lot of the terms are going to begin with M-Y-C-O, myco, okay? And when we look at fungi, it's going to include the study of yeast, molds, and of course those fleshy fungi, the mushrooms. One other thing to note just about fungi is that they're very diverse and they're very adaptive to different environments. And you're going to find them in places that you might not find a lot of other things, especially bacteria. Why? Because it's going to have a high acidic level because that pH is really low. Or it's going to have a high osmotic pressure because it's got a lot of salt or a lot of sugar. So think a little bit about your foods. When they tend to go bad and you have something growing on them, it's generally not a bacteria. It's generally going to be a fungus. Now, in order to really understand the fungi, we got to talk a little bit about a morphology. So let's start first with what are the single cellular fungi. Those are referred to as yeast. And if you're looking at yeast under a microscope, you will notice that they're going to be round or spherical in shape. Sometimes they'll go a little bit oval. They're not always even looking, as you would notice with bacteria that are round in shape. They're almost always uniform in shape and size. Not necessary in yeast. They're going to be all different round shapes and oval shapes. Now, they do reproduce, and when they reproduce, they use a system known as budding. And you can see here in the picture the little buds coming off from the parent type of cell. Sometimes those buds don't fully separate, as you see down here, and that term is referred to as pseudohypha. Now, when we talk about multicellular fungi, those are going to be your molds and your mushrooms. The mushrooms being the macroscopics, molds being micro and macro, depending on what state they're in. Some terms for morphology when we talk about the multicellular fungi. First, a term you need to know is hypha or hyphae for plural. These are going to be the long filaments, okay, of cells that you see here. Okay, so all of these pictures, this is hypha that you're seeing here. So the cells come together and form these tubular shapes known as hypha. Now, difference between the top and the bottom picture as well is you'll notice here the hypha in the top one, you see there are some divider lines, segments, okay? Those lines are known as septa. And down here, you notice it's a clear picture and there are no septa. So this one up here is, you will say that the fungus is septated hypha, and the bottom or lower picture is a non-septated hypha. Now these are going to be at the microscopic level. However, as the cells replicate and divide and become larger and larger masses, then we refer to the fungus as a mycelium when it's a large mass, and it is the mycelium that you will see when you see fungus on your foods and things like that. Okay, so it's a large mass is known as a mycelium. Now, when we talk about fungal reproduction, this is probably the most complex part about fungus. Fungus can reproduce asexually. All of them reproduce asexually. Most will produce sexually as well, but not all. When fungi reproduce, they form what is known as spores. And in order to be able to classify or to group our fungi, you have to use the information that you find from the asexual classification as well as the sexual classification, and then that is how we identify them. So that asexual structures, those are referred to generally as anamorphs, and the sexual structures are known as telomorphs. And so we're going to look a little bit more at the anamorphs and the telomorphs, and you're going to get some terminology that you need to know for class. Okay, so first starting with the asexual reproduction. Now, if it is asexual, it is going to occur through mitosis. Go back to your prereq courses. Mitosis means that you take a cell and it's going to divide into two cells, and those two cells are going to have identical genetics. So that means it is asexual reproduction. When fungi reproduce using the asexual reproduction, they produce two different kinds of spores. One is known as a sporangiospore, the other is known as a coccidiospore. If it is a sporangiospore, that's going to be the top figure. Then when mitosis occurs, it occurs in what is known as a sporangium, a sac that is going to be located on top of the stalk, which is the sporangiospore. And that stalk is basically going to come from the hyphae on up. Okay, so if it's contained within a sac, when the spores are reproduced through mitosis, it's going to be a sporangium is the sac, sporangiospores is the term for the spore production. On the other hand, notice down here, okay, you see that you have spores being produced, the little structures coming off the end here. And again, this is developing off of the hypha, okay, but there's no sac around it. These are basically free spores, so they get produced and they go just directly out into the environment. This is referred to as a candidiospore. So when it's not enclosed in a sac, it's a candidiospore. When it's closed within a sac, it's a sporangiospore. And both of those are asexual reproductions through mitosis. All right, just some general pictures, okay, to help. So notice two different kinds of sacs here, whereas down here the candidiospores are a lot more varieties of how they push off their spores. Okay, now those were asexual reproductive modes. In the sexual reproductive modes, again, you're going to have to go through reproduction. You're going to have two parental nuclei joining, so it's going to be meiosis because we're going to have a change in genetic material. And then when the spores are produced, you're going to have three main types of spores: the zygospores, ascospores, and basidiospores. Okay, so based on that asexual and sexual reproduction, we end up classifying our fungi into four groups based on their sporulations: the chytridiomycota, the zygomycota, the ascomycota, and the basidiomycota. The chytridiomycota, these are going to be aquatic fungi. There's not a lot you need to know on this, but this is by far the most primitive form of the fungi that we have. Asexual reproduction occurs through the sporangiospore, so with the sac. Sexual reproduction is going to occur through what is known as conjugation, and it forms a zygote. Okay, so a little bit different, but that is one of the types of fungi, and again, it is the chytridiomycota. The zygomycota. Why do you need to know this one? One term I want you to automatically associate as soon as you hear zygomycota is that it's the ones that belongs to black bread molds. Okay, so those molds that you see on your breads, those are the zygomycota. Okay, now asexual reproduction is their main form of reproduction, and that's why you can go one day and look at the bread and you don't see it, and the next day all of a sudden that mycelium is all over and you're seeing it everywhere. So it's generally through asexual reproduction. They can produce very rapidly. Generally, these are not going to be pathogenic, okay? Even though I know you see them on your breads and stuff, they're generally not pathogenic. So asexual reproduction, because again, you need to know both what types of spores are produced asexually and sexually. So through asexual reproduction, they use the sporangiospores. That is going to be in that sac. Sexual reproduction is going to occur because of the hyphae, again, are going to conjugate, and they're going to produce those zygospores, okay? And then those examples, again, black bread mold, the Rhizopus nigricans is your common black bread mold, and then another very common zygomycota is the mucor. Ascomycota. This is another very common type of fungus. It's known as a sac fungus, is another name for it. These are going to be molds that have that, remember that term, septated hypha, and in some cases it's going to contain some yeast in this group of fungi. They are going to produce asexually using the candidiospores. So again, that's going to be the one without the sac around it. They're going to produce those spores. And in this case, the candidiospore kind of looks like this. Think of it almost like a dandelion. And when you blow the dandelion, then all of those seeds go everywhere. That's kind of what this is like. Even though they're not seeds, they are spores. So they're going to use candidiospores for their asexual reproduction method. The sexual reproduction method is the ascospores, and it's going to be enclosed in a sac. So their asexual reproductive mode is not enclosed in a sac. The sexual reproductive mode is. This is going to be a group that is going to have the antibiotic producing fungi, in particular penicillin notatum. Other examples of Ascomycota that are important to know are the Saccharomyces, which is the ones that the brewer's yeast, the Trichophyton, which is going to be something that causes athlete's foots, and Aspergillus, okay, which is going to be carcinogen, aflatoxins, and things in that nature. Now, the last group of fungi is the Basidiomycota. This is the club fungus. Again, not a whole lot that you need to know, but do recognize that Basidiomycota are that macroscopic club fungus, so the mushrooms, the toadstools, etc. Asexual reproduction is going to be through their hyphae, not necessarily those two terms that we've used before of Candidiospore or Sporangiospore. But they do have a sexual reproduction mode of basidiospores, and that's because they produce a basidium on the base of their stalk area. And again, the example to consider is the mushrooms and the club fungus and all of those, the toadstools, etc. Now, with the fungi, there's one other special group that you do need to be aware of, and that is known as the dimorphic fungi. And that's called dimorphic because di for two, morph because of change. So it is the one fungal group that can change between a yeast and a mold. And what is going to matter if it's a yeast or a mold is going to be temperature. And the most common one for this is the Candida albicans. And so it's going to be mold form when it is cooler, 25 degrees Celsius kind of scenario. But notice 37 degrees Celsius. And what's significant about 37 degrees Celsius? Of course, that's the body temperature. So when it gets into the body at 37 degrees, it goes from being mold to the yeast form, and then it's going to produce things such as thrush, okay, that you've heard of before. So again, this is the one example. It's a dimorphic fungi. It is a Candida, which is going to be yeast forms, and that's going to cause the vaginal infections, thrush, etc. that can be issues for humans. Last slide is just to kind of hit the highlights of mycoses. Myco, obviously the fungal group there, but mycoses means that these are the diseases. So human fungal diseases do occur. They are very difficult for us to cure in many cases. Why? Because it's a eukaryotic cell. So unlike bacterial infections or diseases, the bacterial structure is so very different, cellular structure is than from the human eukaryotic cell, whereas the fungal group is a eukaryotic cell, so it has very much a similar structure. So if you go to destroy the fungal cell, you're oftentimes going to find that you are damaging yourself cells. So that's what makes it so hard to get rid of those superficial cutaneous kind of things. So think about the superficials. Those are the keratinization tissues. So when you get nail fungus, how long does it take you to get rid of them? You can have the subcutaneous, so it's going to be in the lymphatic, and those can be difficult. You can have some systemic ones, but all of them are difficult to get rid of. Athlete's foot, the histoplasmosis, and a lot of them are just opportunistic. They get in and then they take advantage of the situation because you give them such a great environment to live in. So with that, that's the conclusion for the fungals. The main things to take away is that you need to know the different terminology for the morphology, the asexual spore terms, the sexual spore terms, and then how you can use those to classify into one of the four groups of fungi. So just some overview of the fungus, and let me know if you have any other questions.